Hey, you guys, you want to hear a weird story? So at the turn of the century, back in like the early 1900s, the spiritualist movement was huge, like at its peak, and people were always like trying to talk to like dead people, and mediums like the Fox sisters and Andrew Jackson Davis were like the rock stars of the time. And people would flock to these mediums and experience things like spirit photography, ectoplasm imagery, crystal balls, candlelight, possession writing on like chalkboards, objects around the room would move on their own. They would hear things like rapping on tables, knocking on the walls, ringing of bells and tambourines. You've ridden in Haunted Mansion at Disneyland, right? Like the Madame Leota scene? Yeah, it was kind of like that. Basically, it was bananas, and everyone around the world, but in particularly North America, people were convinced it was all real, and that what they had experienced happened without any explanation, physically impossible by any means of science or logic. At least in this realm. But that's not what this story is about. But in a way it kind of is, because it is what actually inspired what this story is about. It inspired something that happened about 40 years later. Starting in the 30s and 40s, there was a secret race happening. And it wasn't to the moon. This race was actually for information. The information of your enemy. And in order to get that information, whatever the subject matter, you had to have spies. But not spies like James Bond or Mission Impossible or even like Austin Powers type of stuff. This is something different. Something a little more alternative. And so countries were spending millions of dollars funding these super secret alternative methods, these super secret black projects that were researching and testing questionable means of obtaining information from your enemy. Things and methods like remote viewing, psychics, telekinesis, MK Ultra, and other supernatural and strange and unusual techniques. One of these black projects, one of these experiments, was actually called the Duluth Project, and oddly enough, it was created and overseen by my great-grandfather, Dr. Jonathan Hesser Noonan. Yeah, they had weird names back then. And this guy was a little crazy, not just because he was Irish, he was on the ally side, like the good kind though, by the way, but because he had this theory of being able to train and communicate with dogs, both verbally and telepathically, taking inspiration from the ways in which those old spiritualist mediums would supposedly communicate with the dead. You see, the idea of the Duluth Project was he would take several of these trained dogs and release them into the towns and cities, an area that the enemies controlled. The dogs would sort of wander around the town like strays and target a specific area and hang around there and observe and listen, taking advantage of these dogs' good eyesight and hearing, etc., right? Then my great-grandfather, Jonathan Hesser Noonan, he would then dress up like a bum, and then he'd stumble through town at night like he was drunk. I mean, like he was Irish, right? So like totally, not very method here. But that's not what's important. And so he'd stumble around, and then he'd stumble and get to wherever the rendezvous point was, take a glass, throw it on the ground, shattering the glass in the street. That was the audio signal to tell the dogs to come and find him. And like a Pied Piper or like the Child Snatcher from Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, he'd load the dogs up into his truck, take them back to like his office or whatever for their treats and rewards, and like have this debriefing. This is the main dog that he first trained and would use as the model for the other dogs he would then attempt to train and utilize. So my great-grandfather, when he was a kid, his mother took him to one of these spiritualists that could supposedly talk to dead people. And then they'd use like these tambourines and ask spirits to like rap on the wall to respond, things like that. He remembered that experience and figured he could apply it to communicating with these dogs, and he'd use this sort of like old hotel bell, for example, and he'd train the dogs to tap it with their paws and ring it once for yes and two for no, sort of similar to how the spiritualists used to ask the spirits to respond to questions by ringing a bell. This is actually his bell. These were his chalkboards that he used to use back in the day to sort of draw maps or diagrams or something, and then he'd have like the dogs like, I guess, like take their nose and like point to them or something like that. I don't know, I wasn't really there. This is what he would use to try to communicate with the dogs, and people at the time thought it was crazy, you know, training them human words and this sort of thing. But I'm not sure if you guys have seen these videos of people who have actually trained their dogs to communicate with humans with a little touchpad. If you haven't, watch this.
Pull outside, good girl.
Maybe not so crazy, but I mean, this is basically the stuff that my great-grandfather was trying to do back in the day, but he was trying to use it for dogs as spies. I mean, the program supposedly never went anywhere, and I guess it eventually did get shut down or something. Or did it? So when my grandmother passed, my mother inherited these items and these heirlooms, the chalkboards, the notebook, his bell, that sort of thing. And it used to be in the living room, like on display, like, you know, above on the mantle and that sort of thing. And she'd keep it out there, and we wouldn't really talk about it, but because it had such a crazy backstory to it, right? Until several years into my teens, I got to go to my first slumber party. So real quick, just first, like, think back to like how excited you were to get invited to your first like overnight party, like your first slumber party. You're so stoked to get to go, and like I remember mine, and I wanted to be like the cool kid that brought like not just, you know, GoldenEye or something on N64. I wanted to like be the cool kid that brought like something that was the next level. But so anyway, this one time I took it to a slumber party and like told the story and tried to get everybody to like light a candle and make like a salt circle or something, and tried to use that same theory that had been experienced at, you know, the psychic medium encounter, and to try to communicate with the dead using some of these very personal items and like the energy source of my friends and stuff, and to like try to use it as a draw of the energy to try to communicate. I don't know what I'm really talking about. I had just seen The Craft for the first time, so like needless to say, by the end of the night, I never got asked to another slumber party ever again because I made it weird. But maybe we should try to communicate. Try and make contact one more time.